Hello, everybody. I'm Andrew Davis, a member of the Mideast Forum of Falmouth Committee, and I'd like to welcome you to the second lecture of our 2024 season. Today's talk is Where Do We Go From Here? Assessing Iran's Role in the New Middle East, presented by Behnam Ben Taleblue, a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defensive Democracies. We'll introduce him formally in just a minute. For those of you new to the forum, we're a 501c3 nonprofit organization founded in 2006. Over the course of each summer season, we present a series of talks that represent a range of perspectives and opinions addressing the complex issues facing the Middle East. Just to review the logistics for today, after our speaker's presentation, there'll be time for audience Q&A. Please use the Q&A feature on your screen, not the chat function, to ask questions. Questions, of course, can be submitted at any time during the session. After the Q&A, we'll wrap up with a few brief comments and end around 6 o'clock. And I should tell the audience we're experiencing a severe thunderstorm right now in Falmouth, and anything could happen. But now I'll turn this over to my colleague, Samin Madani, who will introduce today's speaker.
Good afternoon, and welcome to today's seminar by Behnam Ben Taleblue. Behnam is a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, or FDD, a think tank in Washington, D.C., where he focuses on Iranian security and political issues. For over a decade, Behnam has supported FDD's Iran work in various capabilities, including as a research fellow and senior Iran analyst. Prior to his time at FDD, Behnam worked on non-proliferation issues at an arms control think tank in Washington. Leveraging his subject matter expertise and native Persian language skills, Behnam closely tracks a wide range of Iran-related functional and regional topics, including nuclear non-proliferation, ballistic missiles and drones, sanctions, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard and its proxies, the foreign and security policy of the Islamic Republic, and internal Iranian politics. Frequently called upon to brief journalists, congressional staff, diplomatic, military, and policy audiences in Washington, across the US, and around the world, Behnam has also guest lectured on Iran in various classes and seminars at Georgetown and George Washington universities, and has his own course on modern Iran at Johns Hopkins University. Behnam has testified before the US Congress and Canadian Parliament and provided oral and written evidence to the UK House of Commons Foreign Affairs Committee. 1 month before Iran's historic overt and direct drone and missile attack against Israel in April, Behnam predicted the increased direct and overt use of these systems by Iran in the pages of the Wall Street Journal. His analysis has been quoted, and his articles have appeared in the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Reuters, and Associated Press, among others. Behnam has also appeared on a variety of broadcast programs, including PBS NewsHour, BBC News, Fox News, and CBS News. Behnam earned his MA in International Relations from the University of Chicago and his BA in International Affairs and Middle East Studies from the George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. We are thrilled to have Behnam as our seminar speaker today. So without further ado, I'd like to turn the podium to Behnam.
Thank you so much, everyone. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here, and thanks to everyone for tuning in virtually to today's session at the Middle East Forum of Falmouth. Dr. Maidani, thank you both for your hospitality and friendship, and to the entire board and membership at MEFF for having me today. I know with a topic as complex and interesting and newsworthy as we see with the recent electoral cycle in the Islamic Republic of Iran, that you do want to leave as much time for Q&A as possible. So I'll try to provide my comments today in a bit more of a briefer or kind of a précis fashion to make sure that we can make this as interactive and as engaging as possible. And with that, I'd like to leap into it. The nature of our conversation about Iran today is relational. It's not studying Iran relative to itself. It's not studying the government relative to itself. It's studying Iran relative to the region. It's about Iran in a changing Middle East. And where that intersects with Americans in Falmouth or across the Cape or across America is the world of U.S. foreign policy. What is it about the U.S.-Iran relationship that has brought us to this point? And what is it about the U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East more generally that is worth noting here? The first I'd like to say is that while many can be hard on themselves, Western policymakers, Western academics, Western defense experts, about getting Iran wrong or about failing in the region, what I have to offer today is a bit of a cautionary note from the other side. Namely, what happens when you succeed, albeit in the short term, in the Middle East? Part of the theory that I'll posit today is some of the shortcomings and failures that we have in the Middle East, we as Americans, we who focus on foreign and security policy, is the failures that stem from success rather than failure. By way of a few small examples, before we get to the October 7 and post-October 7 Middle East, it's worth noting a couple of trend lines here. There's no doubt that Washington has a high degree of interest, high degree of capability in countering and containing the broad and diverse threat posed by the Islamic Republic of Iran to U.S. partners, U.S. allies, and U.S. interests in the heartland of the Middle East. But the question, in my view, has always been one of follow-through. For example, there's been a whole host of different arms embargoes and economic sanctions imposed on Iran since the 1980s. But sometimes the lack of a follow-through, particularly on one side, and the over-success or over-investment of one tool towards one threat on the other, has led the adversary to adapt and offset some of those capabilities that we would have defined as a success. Exhibit A is some of those conventional arms embargoes designed to make sure that the Iranian formal military does not modernize in the 1980s and 1990s. The net result, even though the regime's conventional strike capabilities, such as fighter jets and other attack aircraft, are significantly weak and are a dated force from the 1970s at best, is that the Islamic Republic of Iran today is home to the largest and most diverse ballistic missile arsenal in the Middle East. So trying to make sure that the regime doesn't have a modern air force has led the regime to adapt and offset and develop a relatively robust long-range strike capability in the form of cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, and as we see much more recently and across 4 different continents now, drones. Something similar can be said about trying to contain the spoiler effect of Iran on Arab-Israeli peace, Palestinian-Israeli peace, from the Madrid conference up until today. If you remember, before the post-October 7 Israel-Hamas war, following the Hamas and Iran-sponsored terrorist attack against Israel on October 7th that killed over 1,200 people in Israel, was a previous war between Israel and Gaza. That certainly wasn't the first war, in my view, based on the way things are shaping out. It certainly won't be the last war either. But if you remember, there was that 11 or 12-day conflict in May of 2021, between Israel and Iran-backed Palestinian terror and rejectionist forces from the Gaza Strip. The successes that actually Israel enjoyed, successes on the military front, coupled by an inability to translate some of those military successes into political wins, coupled with a year earlier, if you may remember, the creation and soon after the extension of a thing called the Abraham Accords, which was designed to bring different elements of the U.S. force and alliance structure, such as U.S. ties with countries in the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, such as Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, in with Israel, was a very significant move. And it was a significant move because it happened to be a tightening of American partnerships between American partners in the region in the face of a rising Iran. Namely, there was an Iranian 800-pound gorilla in the room, or elephant in the room. And in the face of that security challenge, you had diverse actors with no formal political relationships building political and economic and assumedly security relationships as well, because of that shared vision, because of that shared value in the background of that common threat. Well, part of my theory today of why we have to fear more from short-term success, and why sometimes short-term success can be the harbinger of medium to long-term failure, is the short-term successes of the Abraham Accord in 2020, the short-term battlefield successes of Israel during the last Gaza war in May in 2021 may have actually brought us here, where local actors, part of a constellation of forces that the Islamic Republic of Iran has in multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions, multiple failed states, you could say, across the Middle East, but particularly the Palestinian rejectionist forces that exist in the Gaza Strip, such as Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, had local actor agency to try to settle scores following the 2021 war. Marry that into with 500,000-foot strategic actor agency, the patron of those terror and rejectionist forces, the Islamic Republic of Iran, thousands of miles away, that had an interest in signaling to the states that were part of the pro-Western alliance structure, states like the UAE, states like Bahrain, states like Israel, and potentially with all the talk of a potential extension of the Abraham Accords to include the crown jewel in the region, Saudi Arabia, into this political and security alliance architecture as well. The Islamic Republic had big picture agency to try to play the role of spoiler again. So local actor interest, Hamas had an interest in settling scores, playing the role of spoiler. Big picture, the Islamic Republic of Iran had an interest, had agency in playing the role of spoiler. And you had essentially this symbiosis that brought us to the terror attack of October 7, that they hoped by October 8th would accomplish the political goals of bringing, at least for the Palestinian rejectionists and terror forces, the use of violence back into the forefront to adjudicate their political contests and claims. And then for the Islamic Republic of Iran to prevent the cohesion of a regional security architecture they believe was backed by the West against it from forming and solidifying and being expanded to include countries like Saudi Arabia. Now, from the October 7th date onward, you have different views. You have views brought to you by interesting regional reporting found in the Wall Street Journal that say that the Iranians have been planning for over a year and a half in the region, in places like Lebanon, with Palestinian groups, with Iran's most successful proxy force, Lebanese Hezbollah, as well as with elements of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the tip of the spear or the parallel ideological military to the Islamic Republic's actual national military that exists in that country. And together they had been planning this for about a year and a half. This was brought to you by local reporting from the Wall Street Journal. Contrast that with local reporting brought to you by Reuters that said, in fact, Iranian officials, in fact, high-level political, security, military, and even religious officials were shocked by the success of Hamas following October 7th, were unaware of the level of Hamas planning and unaware of the level of secrecy. Both of these theses actually fail to understand the nature of this kind of evolving Iran-backed proxy architecture in the Middle East, which since 2011, 2012, regime officials in Iran have been calling the axis of resistance, or sometimes you hear it in Persian as mehvar muqawamat. So they themselves use the phrase axis. It's not a partisan or political or ideational phrase. And they're talking about a constellation of either Iran-backed groups or Iran-backed forces that in some places, like in Iraq or in Lebanon, were created directly by that group, the IRGC, by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or in failed states in ongoing conflict zones, places like Hamas, places like Gaza with Hamas, or places like Yemen with the Houthis, were able to be co-opted and brought into this larger anti-status quo regional architecture led by the Islamic Republic and co-opted with the provision of material support. Such material support is on full display today when we look at the Houthis, who occupy about a third to about a half of Yemen today on the southern part of the Arabian Peninsula, and are now able to act on threats that the Islamic Republic made way back in 2018, which was indeed to threaten American vessels and other vessels in the Red Sea, in the Bab el-Mandeb, and in the Gulf of Aden. So there is an arc of instability that the Islamic Republic has been able to effectuate without really paying a price for in these failed states, using these local forces with local actor agency that are in fact emboldened and supported from a 500,000-foot strategic, ideational, and political level by Tehran with unique forms of material support, such that today the Houthis in Yemen, despite being a non-state actor, are in possession of major state-level military capabilities, and they're looking to bring their military capabilities online, such that the drone attacks, the anti-ship cruise missile attacks, and in fact, a tool that no other proxy of Iran has, the anti-ship ballistic missile attacks that the Houthis have been able to use to sink ships, to target ships, are in fact game-changing forces and harbingers of a new Middle East. Now, we can't talk about a changing or a past or a present Middle East without talking about this Iran-Israel shadow war brought to you by the regime's ability to create this cohesive threat architecture in the region, link them up conflict by conflict by conflict, post-Afghanistan, post-Iraq, post-Syrian civil war, post-Israeli withdrawal of Lebanon, post-Syrian withdrawal of Lebanon, amid the Lebanese civil war, taking advantage of every conflict to find downtrodden and dispossessed people to bring forward the ideational goals of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And through different boom and bust rounds and cycles of violence that we've seen in the Middle East over the past 3 to 4 decades, the Islamic Republic has been able to put a sword first in these hands, in these folks' hands, and then sharpen that sword over time, such that one need only look over press reporting the past week or 2 weeks to understand and see this potential talk of a war between Israel and Lebanon being a matter of when rather than if, because of this changing force that exists in the hands of Iran's proxies, which have slowly not just encircled a whole host of American partners in the region, as well as a whole host of American diplomatic and military facilities, but also Israel itself. And if some of you may remember, the old First Secretary General of NATO had talked about the goal of NATO after he had stepped down was to keep the Russians out, was to keep the Germans down and the Americans in. You know, the goal of this 4-decade-long consistent trend of Iranian foreign and security policy by the Islamic Republic has been to keep the Americans out, to keep the Arabs down, and to keep these militias and proxies in, such that through a death by 1,000 cuts approach, rather than through the classic Arab-Israeli war approach, that they could act on their ideational agenda, which is, and they're quite honest about it, death to Israel. I remember in 2022 writing a piece actually for The Atlantic magazine, talking about the failure of the West to take Putin quite seriously when he was talking about having a desire to invade Ukraine in 2021 and into 2022 if Western and if NATO policy did not change. I think now, several years into that war, as well as almost 8 months-ish into the post-October 7 Middle East, as well as 45 years into the history of the Islamic Republic, we would be doing ourselves a political and strategic disservice to not pay attention to the words coming out of the men who matter in Iran. And to understand where the regime is going and where things will be changing, you have to understand where it is today. And that brings us to 3 other C's that I want to talk to you about. The first is consolidation for the new Middle East. The second is contestation. And then the third is conflict. You're seeing consolidation happen in Iran right now, ultra hardline consolidation at the helm. Political forces are basically taking the already very limited political space in the Islamic Republic and contracting it, and moving it to the hard right, such that one man's elite yesterday or one man's insider yesterday is today's outsider. So you have a smaller pool of political and military elites. And that smaller pool is also more culturally, intellectually, politically coherent in their desire to contest and have even overt conflict. Conflict with their neighbors, conflict with the West, and in particular, conflict with Israel. And that is what is essentially taking this Israel-Iran shadow war that has long existed in the background and begin to slowly and in different phases move it to the foreground. Now, that doesn't mean that what some in Washington may like, which is de-escalation and deconfliction, may still not be happening. In fact, that has been happening to some degree between Iran and, in fact, a major American partner, a country like Saudi Arabia, for instance. They had a historic, I wouldn't call it a peace agreement, but they had a historic détente agreement a little over a year ago, allegedly brokered by China, even though there were indirect and then later direct negotiations between Tehran and Riyadh dating back to 2021 when President Joe Biden came in. And in this sense, this isn't brought to you by a desire by Tehran to have regional peace, but rather to lock in the prospect for regional conflict, much like it's had an ability now to lock in a sword of Damocles over American forces, over Israelis, with the provision of weapons through this diverse terror and proxy network that, again, they themselves are the ones calling the axis of resistance. So what they're looking to do is lock in gains. Sometimes you can lock in those gains through deals, and sometimes you can lock in those gains through conflict. But given how much more cohesive the political elite in Tehran are, on balance, there's a greater desire for conflict than those kind of deconfliction agreements. looking forward and looking abroad, actually, one should say, that as much as Iran is trying to develop a sub-state architecture of proxy forces in the region, it's being driven, and in fact, some could say it's being fueled by an enhanced political and security ties with forces outside of the region, such as Russia. In April of this year, I testified before a joint House Foreign Affairs Middle East subcommittee and Europe subcommittee on the growing Russia-Iran ties. And in there, as an Iranian American, by the way, I should say, I made sure to mention that in the past, half millennia, if not at least several centuries, no country has done more damage to the Iranian national interest than Russia, whether it's in the Tsarist Soviet Union or Russian Federation form. But what we've seen consistently is a desire to move from turbulent Russo-Iranian relations to transactional Russo-Iranian relations into a new phase now, which is the transformational period of Russo-Iranian relations. And whereas historically nationalist impulses would be constraining the degree to which Iran could partner with Russia, because of the Islamic Republic's anti-Western disposition and ideology, and the desire by Putin to instrumentally use this to either bog down America or pro-American forces in another part of the world, or benefit materially from some of these cheaper long-range strike capabilities like drones, and potentially, as is reported, soon to be ballistic missiles, there is more of a convergence in that Venn diagram than ever before. The same, of course, goes to another great power competitor of the United States, which is China. If Putin's Russia is in some ways politically and security-wise underwriting and underlining the threats posed by the Islamic Republic, Xi's China, if I meant to say Putin's Russia, but now Xi's China is the one that is economically giving the Islamic Republic this wherewithal. If you look at the trajectory of oil exports, particularly since the European Union in 2012 issued their ban on Iranian oil imports, you'll see that China, regardless of deal or no deal, or regardless of sanctions or no sanctions, has been both the biggest licit and illicit importer of Iranian crude oil, meaning that the economic artery that underwrites this broad regional threat nexus that we're talking about is brought to also by, indirectly, of course, the People's Republic of China, the Chinese Communist Party, and those in Xi's inner clique or circle at the top there. So just as the Islamic Republic is able to engage in more contest-story actions using these terror and proxy forces at the sub-state level, at the super-state level, what is leading to a more emboldened Islamic Republic and the changing Middle East is these great power partnerships, which is leading to a series of Venn diagrams of countries that don't look alike, that don't think alike, that don't feel alike, that at least in the case of Russia and Iran have divergent and antagonistic and mistrustful relations with one another, but are being able to grow the Venn diagram together because they have a new least common denominator of contesting the West and contesting America, much like Meiji Japan and Nazi Germany in World War II did not look alike, did not think alike, did not talk alike, but began to have significant overlap, because when you shoot in the same direction for a sustained period of time, that's the green sprouts, that's the seedlings, if you will, of a new military come political order. And then finally, the third C, conflict. I lied, there should be 4 C's, because this desire for conflict is brought to you by a newfound capability. When on April 13, April 14, the Islamic Republic launched 300 plus projectiles, a combination of cruise missiles, drones, and ballistic missiles against Israel. That was not indeed the first ballistic missile overt attack for a country that has thus far preferred to have its war in the shadows and thus far preferred to launch weapons from someone else's territory rather than its own territory. In fact, in the past 3/4 decade, since 2017 to present, there have been at least a dozen, if not 13 or 14, overt, direct, and attributable ballistic missile operations launched from Iranian territory at targets as diverse as Kurdish dissidents in Iraq, to ISIS in Iraq, to ISIS in Syria, to alleged Baluch insurgents in Pakistan, and then now to US bases in Iraq, and then now, as of April 13, April 14, towards Israel, towards the Jewish state. In fact, if you look at where Iran was in April of 2014, in April of 2024, in the first 4 months of 2024, the Islamic Republic had launched ballistic missiles at 4 countries, 2 of which were nuclear powers, and still was undeterred. And it is this capability and perhaps an overconfidence. I lied, there should be one more C, overconfidence, this C, confidence, this increased confidence in this newfound capability that is moving the shadow wars of yesterday into the overt and more direct and more limited military engagements of today. So taken together, this rather toxic cocktail of domestic hardline consolidation at home, a desire to build bridges with other great powers that are contestori in their foreign and security policy with America abroad, and then a newfound capability and confidence, if not overconfidence in a certain military capability, is driving the Islamic Republic towards more overt, direct, and attributable conflict now and into the future. There's a lot that is going on that I did not get to touch. We're kind of bordering now on about a pretty close to a half hour. I want to make sure there's time for questions, but those 3 C's that we talked about with the proxies, create, co-opt, control, these 4 or 5 C's that we talked about, changing Iranian foreign policy and security behavior today, consolidation, contestation, confidence, capabilities, and conflict are things to kind of keep in mind as you look at news of a potential new election or selection of presidents in Iran, a potential third Lebanon war between Israel and Lebanon, a potential new US force deployment to the Middle East, or a potential retreat from the Middle East, or a lens for you to study more Russian and more Chinese intervention and involvement, be it economic, political, or military in the Middle East. Because as much as there may be a desire, and you may see this from political candidates as we get deeper into election season here in this country in 2024, as much as there may be a desire for both the left and the right, for both Trump and Biden, to push away from the table on the Middle East, on big picture issues, on great power competition issues, and on particularly China, there is more interest, both on the left, on the right, both with Trump's policies and with Biden's policies, to deal with the likes of less so Russia, but much more so China. So this is food for thought about having some tools with which to look at these headlines, to see these trend lines, and to make sense of this new Middle East and Iran's role in it. I want to forgive you. I want to ask for your forgiveness if I crammed a lot in there, which I'm sure I did. And even though this is Massachusetts, I am a native New Yorker, so I'm sure I talk fast, if not as fast as you guys. So let's turn it over back to questions, and thank you for your time and attention.
Okay. Thank you so much for a very interesting and engaging and informative on a very complex topic. So we do have a few questions. The first question is the hostilities of Iran to Israel primarily geographical or in equal parts religious? And if the former, what kind of compromises could begin a reconciliation with Iran?
It's a great question because it's one that's evolved over time. You know, one of the most important things for the audience to know is certainly this was not at all the relationship between Iran and Israel pre-1979. In fact, it was a fundamentally different relationship between Iran and Israel, much more empathetic, emphatic, and strategic, given that they were pillars of the American Cold War order in that part of the world. The Shah, the late king of Iran, had deep ties with multiple sides of the evolving Israeli domestic political spectrum. And here, of course, it's worth noting that this is not just the story of Iran, but also for those of you who look at other countries in the Middle East, this is also part of the story of Turkey. Iran and Turkey were the first two Muslim majority countries in the Middle East in 1948 and 1949, or if history serves me wrong, 1949 and 1950, that de facto and de jure developed political ties with the Jewish state. Very interestingly, in 2020, you fast forward to when the Abraham Accords was discussed, the first two countries that were critical of Arab-Israeli peace, like the Abraham Accords, were not countries that were Arab, were not countries that had borders with Israel, so it's not that geographic question. Where ironically, it was those two countries that first had recognized Israel about 50, 60 years ago in 1948, 49, or 1949, 50. So this is how far things have changed in capitals like Tehran and in capitals like Ankara. Tehran much more so, much more overtly. But the seeds, the intellectual and ideational seeds that facilitate this change, which came with the Iranian Revolution, were severalfold. One was that many of the revolutionaries, particularly the religious and Islamist revolutionaries, cut their teeth on anti-Israel issues, and in fact were quite anti-Semitic. You can pick up the writings, the lectures, the speeches, the fatwas of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who eventually became the founding father of the Islamic Republic, and those ideas soon transformed themselves into policy. But also because of many currents of domestic political forces in Iran were of the kind of internationalist left, whether they were the armed left, the guerrilla left, the Islamist Marxist left, what have you. They also kind of, like the Soviet Union, had an evolving relationship with all things Israel, particularly after 1967. And that merger of this kind of international left and Islamist hard right, that combination of anti-Israel and anti-Semitic, seeded itself and became official government policy after 1979, such that it's been scaled up today. It has been kind of an orienting and animating calling card to continue to contract the already very limited political space in Iran. Foreign policy is a way to adjudicate your domestic disputes, just as anti-Americanism is, just as anti-Israel is, such that today the only self-styled, reformist, quote unquote, in Iran's presidential electoral contest talks about wanting to have deep ties with every state. Hint, hint, he probably even means America there, except Israel. So this is how much of a taboo it is if you are part of that political elite in Tehran today. And because it is such an ideational taboo, in my view, it is zero-sum. There is no world in which you can kind of have the carve-outs that you did even during the first decade, which was the Khomeini decade, the 1980s, where you had things like Iran-Contra. The ideational element is simply off the chart. And you don't have to take it from me. In 2010, we were talking about Ahmadinejad, former Iranian President Ahmadinejad's anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial. Now we're talking about a 4, 5, 6 front Iran-backed slow death by 1,000 cuts war against the Jewish state. So rhetoric has turned into reality here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Now, another question is, what should the U.S. do with respect to the proxies?
This depends a great deal on both the amount of time that not just this administration, but any administration will devote to the proxy problem, the level of interest, and the cost. The level of interest is how much of a national security threat they believe it to be. For example, if you look at the response ratio from October 7th to present, when Iran-backed Shia militias in Iraq and Syria began to shoot at the U.S. force presence in places like Iraq, Syria, and even Jordan, it's about 170 or 180 to about 17 to 20. So they've fired 170 or 180 times, and the U.S. has only militarily responded about 17 to 20 times. That's a poor response ratio, and that's precisely why you have a lot of these deterrence shortcomings. It's why groups as weak as these proxy groups actually have the political resolve and wherewithal. So if it is of your interest to contest them and to begin to use force, the number one thing I would say is that this response ratio has to be drastically changed. Number 2 and 3 might sound contradictory. Number 2 is to see these conflicts through the Iran prism. Because Iran remains the outsized force militarily, politically, economically behind these proxy forces, it means having a much better, much more coherent, much more cogent Iran policy. Where you can't say one thing about human rights in Iran, but do another, or you can't say one thing about security policy in Iran, but do another. And then this brings me to my third one, which is because these are still local actors, you want to make sure that there is enough pressure on them from their own local constituencies. If you remember in 2019, even at the height, for example, of a lot of the beginnings of this proxy attacks by Iran-backed militias in Iraq, at the Green Zone and at everything else, when they were firing rockets and mortars at the U.S. force presence, even the resumption of IEDs targeting American convoys, there was huge pressure even from Shiite co-religionists protesting in places like Basra, protesting in the suburbs of Baghdad against these Iran-backed Shia militias, simply because of local governance issues at home. So I would press Washington to actually develop a Syria policy. We don't have one today. I would press Washington to actually develop an Iran policy. We don't have one today. I would press Washington to actually think about what kind of capabilities you need to actually defeat the Houthis. You need proxy forces from the UAE on the ground. That's something that's been happening in the background that isn't talked about, because you can't afford to continue to send up $2 million interceptors against $80,000 drones or $180,000 or $400,000 missiles. The U.S. is fundamentally behind the cost curve here, and it's going to have to correct this.
Mhm. Thank you so much. Now, here's an interesting question. How is Iran being affected by and reacting to the climate change?
Oh, it's very significant. I wish I knew more about this because this is something that impacts the daily life of Iranians in Iran, perhaps much more so than this, regional competition. And I want to say this because, sometimes the viewers or readers or people who occasionally will see Iran through the prism of the news may think that there is great coherence between state and society, but fundamentally there is great disconnect and no coherence between state and society, such that you have a revolutionary government in Iran, you have a post-revolutionary society. You have an Islamist authoritarian government in Iran, you have a relatively secular nationalist and democracy-seeking population inside that country. You have a fundamentally anti-American government in that country, in Italy governing that country. You have a fundamentally pro-American population, or at least value-neutral respect relative to the entire Middle East, including US partners and allies, I might add. So you have fundamentally this different jigsaw puzzle between state and society. And so when we talk about the nuclear program or the terror proxies or anything else, it's always important to remember that these things come at the expense of the Iranian national interest and public good because they're regime goods, they're regime dividends, and that's where they remain. Whereas things like dam construction, which has led to major drying up of Iran's actual natural waterways. You've had major environmental and ecological issues in Iran's biggest lake, which is Lake Urumia in the north, or the drying up of one of Iran's historic rivers in one of its most famous cities in Isfahan, the Zayan route. We can go on and on and on. The inability of Iranian planners, architects even at this point in time, to envision moving Iran's capital, which is at the fault line of I think at least 2 or 3 major geological fault lines, and that country routinely has 6+ on the Richter scale magnitude earthquakes. To think about spending time, money, and resources on fixing these issues rather than trying to rechange or rewrite the Middle East.
Thank you so much. So this other question is asking, how might the current election in Iran change things?
If we have to be brutally honest, and I think 45 years is ample time for that, it's not going to change things. It tells you more about where the state of the state is, and by society's lack of participation in it, where things are with society. If you've looked, particularly in the past 2.5 decades, Iran relative to its neighbors, and even relative to many other parts of the world that don't have obligatory voting, I think places like Australia and Brazil do have obligatory voting, minus those countries. The Islamic Republic actually had relatively high levels of turnout despite this state-society divide, and despite the views and values of society versus the views and values of the state. A lot of that has changed with the overpromise and under-delivery of the reform movement, which is kind of basically a shell of itself today, if you could even say that. The overpromise and under-delivery of things like the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, and the fundamental projection, especially by forces in the West, political forces in the West, that misread the fault lines and trend lines in Iran's society and Iran's politics and projected onto candidates something that they themselves either had no ability to do, to transform things at home or things abroad, or had no will to do to transform things at home and abroad. And fundamentally, now you have a situation where Iranians see the street as a better vector for change than the ballot box as a better vector for change, which is precisely why since really 2017 to present, this boom and bust cycle of nationwide anti-regime protests that in 2022, 2023, at its peak touched 150 different cities, provinces, and towns collectively, including villages, that was known as the Zanzendi Azadi or Women Life Freedom protests. Those fundamentally pushed away from the table, and you've had slogans from 2018 even in Iran that talk about Eslah Talab Usulyara Dige Tamum Majara, which translates to reformist, principalist, the jig is up or the game is over. You have a fundamentally different tolerance and appetite in society today, and that translates to boycotts and apathy, which is why this electoral contest now has the lowest ever in the 45-year history of turnout in Iranian presidential elections. It's about to have a runoff, so we'll see what that turnout rate is like. But this is a tale of two cities, a tale of two peoples, even on steroids.
Thanks a lot. Now, here's a history question for you. And the question is, 40 plus years ago, US, Iran, and Israel were the three amigos trading arms for hostages and cash. What happened to this early cooperation?
Well, certainly as you could see now with a couple of European deals and even American deals as late as last summer, August, September of 2023, the US continues to engage in hostage diplomacy with Iran. And that I think is a fundamental problem because hostage taking was one of the first international norms, one of the first international rules that the Islamic Republic really violated with the 444-day hostage crisis. From 1979 to 1981, which many believe lost President Carter the election. And in terms of the ironic historiography that has come out of that moment, many see the fact that the Iranians released the hostages 5 minutes after Reagan was inaugurated as simply being afraid of Republicans or being afraid of Reagan, when in reality you have books as well as interviews with former hostages, former diplomats, who talked about actually the sheer amount of disdain that the hostage takers had for Carter. So they were simply trying to spite President Carter rather than cast a ballot or cast a view or signal their fear of a rising potential different presidential contender from another party. So there is unfortunately a straight line from the US's willingness to engage in this kind of hostage diplomacy that has begot round after round after round of hostages, such that even when the US says these things are not connected, as I believe they were in terms of the phasing from 2015, 2016 in major agreements that unfroze previously Iranian frozen assets, the Islamic Republic believes that they can do this. In fact, you've had a former presidential contender who was a former commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, that in the aftermath of the release of, I think, 4 or 6 American hostages in August or September of last year, a tape from him in 2021 was released saying, this is actually a way with which Iran can adjudicate its business or its economic issues, which was to continue to take American hostages. And if you aggregate out the 6 billion towards the number of people that were freed in the last round of US-Iran hostage diplomacy, it's a $1+ billion mark on the head of those people that were taken, which means that the price of hostage taking has gone up. So unfortunately, unlike the questioner or the viewer or the listener, I don't think this has stopped. I think it's continued and it's gotten worse. And remember when I talked about contestation and copying the patterns of contestation that exist in other countries, look at Russia engaging in hostage diplomacy. There's a huge fear that, as things heat up in terms of the strategic competition with China, that China would be emulating this as well. And even in Iran, you still have lots of dual nationals that live there, that people that travel, that come and go. This is putting more of a threat against them.
Thank you. So another question is, could you speak more on the potential for conflict between Lebanon and Israel and Iran's role in facilitating these hostilities?
I am quite worried about that, the expansion of the conflict into Lebanon, but it's also brought to you by Hezbollah's changing footprint. Sometimes, I live in Washington, I work in Washington. Sometimes in Washington, we have the sin of making everything a screenshot or a Polaroid, when in reality, it should be a video. It should be a story of change over time. The kind of screenshot or the Polaroid that has come about recently, particularly in the post-October 7 Middle East, one happened before, one happened after, is that this large arsenal that's been built to Israel's north in the hands of Lebanon, which is a quantitatively large arsenal of mortars, rockets, missiles, PGMs, anti-tank guided missiles, and drones, is about 150,000 to 200,000, depending on how you count and what source you're counting. And then that quantitative advantage that Iran has helped Hezbollah develop through illicit procurement, through production at home, and through proliferation of components that can then qualitatively take that quantitative advantage, things like rockets, add fins, add guidance systems, and turn them into missiles, turn them into PGMs, basically turn them into precision guided munitions, and begin to slowly render Israel's sophisticated air and missile defense systems less and less and less capable. And remember, we talked about the 2021 war with Israel and Hamas. During that war, Iran was watching, and its security-affiliated media agencies were talking about the financial challenges of warfighting that you now see. And they were talking about whether you intercept these rockets or not, you lose, because if you intercept it, you're paying much more to fire an interceptor at a projectile that's a heck of a lot cheaper. and then you have to decide if you should absorb the strike, if the strike will land somewhere else. So the way the regime called it in their outlets was whether you intercept or not, you lose. So it's a security proposition or it's an economic proposition. And Hezbollah has been quite conscious of that logic. And even though, again, that sin, that cardinal sin, that static image that analysts and policymakers in DC have when they look at Hezbollah, they say, well, this arsenal has been developed, or well, this arsenal has been refined merely to serve as a forward deployed deterrent for the Iranians, such that the Israelis should not or could not then go and freely target Iran's nuclear program because they would risk the kinetic reprisal that would come from their north, from Lebanese Hezbollah. You've seen Lebanese Hezbollah for a group that allegedly, when we looked at the reporting in October and November of last year, when people talked about Hezbollah just doing enough so that they wouldn't be called out from their Shiite co-religionists for not supporting Hamas after the Israel-Hamas war, which came after the October 7 terror attack, you've seen now Hezbollah engage in quite literally the most academic definition of escalation there is. In the 1950s, Herman Kahn wrote a book about a 30-some-odd step ladder called On Escalation, which goes from a political conflict all the way theoretically up until nuclear war. And the three vectors, or the three avenues for escalation that he identified that can move you just from a political crisis or conflict all the way up onto a nuclear war, were as follows: a new weapon, so using a new weapon in the battlefield, a new target, so going after a different kind of target, and a new geography, a new domain. And you see these three things happening by choice by Nasrallah in steroids, but gradually and incrementally over the past 8 months. You just had, for the first time ever, Lebanese Hezbollah threatened an EU member, threatened Cyprus. And unfortunately, they have the capabilities, both in terms of range and accuracy, to be able to strike on land at Cyprus, from Beirut, from Baalbek, from the south of Lebanon, near the Litani, from wherever they may have their projectiles, and particularly surface-to-surface missiles stored. So there is a potential for geographic expansion, just like you've seen the firing go from farms, Sheba farms, all the way until Israeli garrisons, all the way until other farms, all the way until even residences in towns, such that 2-3 weeks ago, pro-Hezbollah and pro-acts of resistance accounts on social media were defining their success as keeping kids from going to schools, or having pictures of major towns be surrounded by flames. And then obviously a changing use of weaponry, the third vector. They've fired anti-tank guided missiles, they've fired drones, they've fired rockets, they've fired mortars, and they have an IRAM, which is an improvised rocket-assisted munition. This is what the Iran-backed militias in Iraq were firing at the U.S. 2010, 2011, when the U.S. was leaving Iraq for the first time there under late term of President Obama. And these things don't go far, but they have a very, very, very heavy warhead. And the Israeli press has been basically fearful of what this weapon can do, and has been talking about these weapons since December of last year. So these three changes, targets, geography, and weapon, are bringing this Israel-Lebanon war much, much, much closer than I think any side really needs, and is having the Israelis see things in the region through the realm of problem solving rather than problem management, which tells you one thing: if they're going to go in the problem solving direction, this is going to be a broad and sustained campaign.
Thank you. So do you think Iran can ever play a positive role in terms of the conflict between Israel and Palestinian? And if yes, what needs to be done to leverage Iran in a positive way rather than the negative role that it's currently playing?
It's an excellent question, and it's fundamentally a question of agency over structure, meaning Iran and Israel don't have the structural dispositions, the borders, the history, the geography that make them compete, and make them compete at this dangerous of a level, as Israel may have had with other states, particularly bordering states, which ironically now it does have peace agreements with several bordering states like Jordan, like Egypt, and with countries that it doesn't have borders, but it does have a similar transnational issue, the Arab-Israeli issue, the plight of the Palestinians. You have an outside-in approach such that Sudan, Morocco, UAE, Bahrain, and then potentially Saudi Arabia are building or warming ties with Israel as well. So those structural issues aside, in my view, the Israel-Iran conflict is fundamentally a conflict brought to you by agency, brought to you by, quite literally, the men in Iran who have a fundamentally different view of how to adjudicate the Israeli-Palestinian issue and how to use the Palestinian issue, for lack of a better word, as a human shield to advance not Iran's strategic interests, but the Islamic Republic's strategic interests. And this is a fundamental paradigm, really, and that is different because even back to 2009, some of you may remember the Green Movement. That's when, for the first time, the regime's foreign and security policy began to become a vector of society-wide protest against the state, which is when the population was chanting "Na Gaza, na Lebanon, Janam Fada Iran," or "Not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life only for Iran." That was a nationalist critique at an Islamist government for spending money on something that they believed was not only futile, but that was actually ruining the name and the views and the values of Iran on the world stage. And as you've seen, the regime has paid this significant and heavy price for that. So until, in my view, you have a fundamentally different cadre of men, and honestly, a fundamentally different political system in Tehran, you're going to see more of this intensification. And just a small note about the past, a lot of the Cold War historiography is being revised, given that a lot of stuff on the archival side, both in terms of Iranian diaspora archival, oral histories, as well as declassified US and declassified Western government material about the past 30, 40 years is coming to the fore. And what we're seeing is that even late into the mid to late 70s, the late King of Iran had a different relationship with the Israelis as he began to build bridges with the Arab world, such as post-Nasser Egypt, for example. So it is possible for Iran to play the role of a more balanced state, a bit more of a balanced broker, but fundamentally not now with the men at the helm and the nature of the political system. And that's brought you by, we talked about those seedlings, that's brought you by the seedling of the ideology. Fundamentally, when you cut your teeth on an issue, you can't undo that move.
Thank you. And here's another question for you. What do you know about smugglers who bring goods from Iran and trade for goods from Oman and the UAE? They make 2 trips per day. The authorities look the other way.
If it's smuggling into Iran as well as out of Iran, if you even remember back during a very hardline administration in Iran, the Ahmadinejad government, 2005 to 2013, I think in his first term, even Ahmadinejad referred to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps as our smuggler brothers. It was even a slur, our Baradan Pashashi, the people who were bringing in the things that the state would punish you for, and that would be rendered illicit if they caught you for, but still the state derived a benefit by getting a cut through these illicit smuggling networks. If you do a lot of open source Persian investigations like I do, you'll even see that during this time, different factions of the regime are warring with themselves to reveal that the IRGC even operates, or operated at that point, but I'm sure it's more now, separate jetties, such that which they would come in, or that which would go out would not be subject to basically Iran's version of Customs and Border Patrol. It's basically the state within the state. And I want to talk to you about the reverse now, which is the UAE and Oman, because in this world where currently the major US policy tools towards Iran are political and economic rather than military, or if the US does have military policies or tools towards Iran, they're much more passive. It's military drills that we're engaging in. It's arms sales to regional countries. It's integrating air and missile defense. It's moving assets more forward in the theater, but it's nothing kind of vis-a-vis direct, overt, and kinetic from America to Iran. Hopefully, no conflict, but the point is that because it's passive, it's not active, the active measures have to be scrutinized to determine their success or determine their failure. And in this case, ironically and unfortunately, even under the peak of US unilateral sanctions, the period of 2018 to 2020, regional countries that were, in terms of their political orientation, much more towards the US than towards the Iranians, countries like the UAE, countries like Oman even, were major sources of sanctions busting and illicit revenue generation for those same networks and individuals that also happen to be harboring the imports or managing the imports of those otherwise restricted goods in Iran. So it's a double-edged sword. And Hedging, most unfortunately, is a norm in that region. It's a way of life. But as you begin to standardize and develop better business practices, these are things that you're going to have to crack down on, particularly if there's a change in Washington after 2024 and these economic pressure tools are embraced again. You're going to have to understand what made these tools work in the past, what were their macroeconomic features of success, and then how do you scale them up, and where do you seal down the valves or the oxygen pathways that the regime had generated to survive major American unilateral sanctions in the past. And it's not just illicit oil sales to China, it's non-dollar trade, it's bartering, and it's regional trade.
Thank you so much. And a couple of more questions, and then we're going to let you rest a bit. So one question is, why was Iran unwilling to agree to a restored JCPOA that President Biden tried to revive?
I don't think anyone can blame President Biden for trying very hard, both during the campaign period as well as his first few years in office, to try to resurrect and restore the JCPOA. Lest we forget, he campaigned, in my view, correctly in 2020 on the need for not just the JCPOA, but he campaigned on the need for a longer and stronger or a better economic deal, a better nuclear deal with Tehran. And this was things that people who became his cabinet members, people like Jake Sullivan, people like Anthony Blinken, were also saying to the press and to the US Congress as well, that they need a better deal than the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. And that was basically the campaign period 2020 up until April of 2021, when indirect nuclear diplomacy with Iran begins. And the Biden administration has indirectly several rounds of indirect nuclear diplomacy with the outgoing Rouhani administration. But with the incoming Raisi administration, and this is something for us to remember in Iran, but even though the president doesn't control foreign policy, even stylistic changes can be emblematic of a deeper shift within Iran's security state and apparatus. And at that point in time, 2020-21, the regime felt confident that it would outlast American sanctions. In fact, it was riding the high that it had, survived the Trump era sanctions. It knew the Biden administration wanted to take a drastically different approach. It didn't feel the need to be counterproductive, and therefore, in 2021 and 2022, when the Biden administration was working so hard to rebuild bridges with international partners like the E3, which opposed the U.S. walkout of the 2015 Iran nuclear deal in 2018. The Iranians at that point in time, while we were rebuilding bridges with our partners and trying to negotiate and trying to keep a united front, not just with our partners, but with Russia and China as well, which became increasingly harder after February 2022 with the Russia-Ukraine war, the Iranians had built an incredible amount of leverage. And while at that point in time in 2021, 2022, many thought in Washington this leverage created by, first, the enrichment of uranium to 60% purity. This was a threat the regime made a decade ago, but only felt comfortable acting on in 2021. Second, the development of uranium metal, for which the regime has no immediate need for, particularly uranium metal with highly enriched uranium, including with basically 20% uranium. So you're basically modeling how you're going to build the metal core for a potential bomb in a potential nuclear warhead. And then the third is the testing, installation, and use of more advanced centrifuges. Those are the machines that spin and enrich uranium. When you have a more advanced one, you can enrich a greater volume at a greater rate. So in fact, a smaller physical program can yield a greater external enriched output. And together, these three things gave the regime the confidence such that one may have seen their development of these things as a negotiating chip or as a bargaining chip, but in reality, they became the groundwork for a much more significant Iranian nuclear expansion, simply because they didn't believe that there was the will or the capability to enforce those sanctions, because the Biden administration had actively campaigned against it. So it would be quite awkward, and indeed it remains quite awkward for the Biden administration to be in a position of embracing pressure on Iran, given the desire to draw a 180-degree difference between itself and its predecessor. And the second is that the way Iran is seeing its nuclear infrastructure is changing quite literally before our eyes. I think at least 3 times in 2024 alone, the regime has talked about having all that it needs to produce a nuclear weapon. This is a far, far, far cry from the mid-2000s, where the regime had to fib and talk about a nuclear, quote-unquote, fatwa that would prohibit weaponization. We're in a drastically different world today, and that drastically different world is brought to you by the comfortability with contestation and confrontation and conflict, brought to you by confidence in their capabilities. So these C's that we talked about before are not just limited to the regional world. They're very much limited to the nuclear world, such that today, the Europeans who oppose President Trump's pressure policy, unilateral withdrawal, are now to the right of Biden administration. And they're the ones calling for more political and economic pressure on Tehran. And the Biden administration is still the one trying to figure out, is Tehran interested in a deal, yes or no? And will these presidential elections or selections have any effect?
So with that, thank you so much. I mean, again, for a very engaging and informative lecture, and also all the responses. And I also want to thank the audience for their very interesting questions that they asked. And I'm going to now turn the podium back to Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you, Samin, and thank you to Behnam Ben Taleblue for being with us today. I think I speak on behalf of everybody that we're very grateful for your in-depth analysis and your precision and your insights, as well as what I would call a breathtaking command of recent history. So thank you again.
Thank you.
I have 1 minute of closing comments, and let me bring up the slide here. There we go. So I'd like to just tell everybody about next week's speaker. I'm sorry, it's not next week. It's July 14th, and we'll be hosting John London, the Executive Director of the Alliance for Middle East Peace. I should point out that unlike our typical seminars, the July 14th event takes place at noon in order to accommodate the time zone shift between Falmouth and John Linden's residence or his location. His presentation is titled Bottom Up and Outside In, Diplomacy and Peace Building in the Wake of the Israel-Palestine, the greatest ever crisis. This ever-unfolding situation in the Middle East being what it is, this talk should prove to be most interesting. And lastly, let me comment on this organization, the Middle East Forum of Falmouth. You can go now to the website that you see on the screen to register for future talks, to access the recordings of recent lectures. This recording should be available by hopefully tomorrow, and for information about making donations that enable us to continue to offer these lectures free of charge. As they say on PBS, we're thankful to viewers like you. We also welcome your comments and suggestions, including speaker recommendations. Go to infomef.world to get in touch with us. With that, I'll offer a final thank you to Behnam Ben Taleblue, to Samin for moderating, and to all of you in the audience, wherever you may be. Have a great rest of your day. Good evening.